Do you remember the first piece of fantasy media you ever experienced? If you're like me, it filled you with a sense of wonder and made you feel like you were a part of the adventure. Unless like the first thing you watched was The Dark Crystal, then all you probably felt was fear. Fantasy anime used to make me feel like that all the time. Stories about heroes on epic quests and these really cool and unique worlds, but these days, most fantasy anime can be summed up to an overpowered hero in a very generic European setting, or it's just another isekai. Dungeon Meshi, however, is one of the few exceptions. When I am watching this show, it feels like I'm witnessing a real adventure, one full of wonder, exploration with danger constantly around the corner, despite the fact that 90% of the show is about cooking and eating monsters. My priority in this video isn't to spoil the series or dive into how surprisingly dark it can get like a lot of other videos do. I just want to talk about how Dungeon Meshi manages to capture something most fantasy anime have lost. The story is actually really simple. The story starts with an adventuring party in a dungeon fighting a red dragon, and it is not going well for them. It is so bad that one of their spellcasters sacrifices herself to teleport the rest of the party outside to safety. Once they're safe, they determine they can probably go back and save her before the dragon digests her. And so after a little bit of preparation, they head back into the dungeon to rescue their party member. This is a classic narrative device called the call to adventure. Believe it or not, it's very important in adventure stories to have this, which is why it's crazy most fantasy adventure anime don't do it at all. Instead, what they do is they give their main character a very broad goal, which leads to the stories looking like this, very linear. Each episode could probably be summed up to the main character going from point A to point B, beating the shit out of someone or something to complete their goal for that episode, which is probably to help some woman with gigantic boobs. Because for whatever reason, they think the goal is the adventure. This is why the call to adventure is very important, because it gives you a very clear goal. And then what you do is you put some roadblocks and detours in between that goal, so that way the main character can't easily complete it. That's the adventure. That's how your story goes from looking like this to like this. It also just adds stakes and motivation for the characters, as they're not just saving their friend, they also are saving the party leader's sister. And they aren't simply doing it because they are goody two-shoes that were written that way and they need to be the heroes of the story. And it helps us an early connection with these characters because we know what type of people they are if they're willing to go into this very dangerous dungeon to save their friend and sister. But also these characters are just very likable in general. Their dynamic is something akin to being like a D&D party. Leos is the fighter, Marcel the wizard, Chilchuk the rogue/thief, Senshi the ranger, and fan service. They all genuinely feel like they're the main characters of their own story, and they've just come together to work as a team. Which is nice, because usually a lot of times a lot of fantasy anime will give the spotlight to one character and the rest of them are just kind of there. Even the side characters feel like they could be the main characters of their own story. We're just not following them, we're just following this party. And the chemistry between the main cast is where Dungeon Meshi really starts to shine, because their chemistry is really good. I honestly just don't know what it is. Their banter, jokes, and arguments don't feel like scripted anime dialogue. They generally feel like real people who have been traveling together for a long time and are slightly getting sick of each other. As they walk through the dungeons, they just talk about the most random stuff. Their favorite shops, restaurants, foods that they miss from back home. But all these tiny conversations give us an insight into their personalities and their backstories and make them feel like real people. And they generally bounce off of each other in a way that I've never seen any other fantasy anime capture. It really does give me D&D vibes a lot of the time, because they can be locked in 1 second and get the job done very efficiently, communicating like they've done this 100 times before. But then the next second, Laos is just being way into monsters again, and all of a sudden they're just a bunch of goobers making jokes again. But it all flows naturally, like it doesn't feel out of place. And yes, this series has very serious and dark moments that it handles very well. Every YouTuber talking about Dungeon Meshi will tell you this. I think the reason why so many people cling to this is the fact that this is very much a comedy show, and so when it does get dark, it does it very well. The really dark moments are kind of used to remind you that, hey, they're in a dungeon and it's dangerous and there are monsters and they are not on top of the food chain in here. And the more serious moments are used to have the characters go through a lot of character development. I think my favorite one is when Marcel kind of starts to feel like she's a burden, so she goes off on her own and tries to prove that she isn't. And then she kind of gets stunned and is kind of put into this childlike state. And then when they find her, she really starts to just kind of spew her true emotions, and they hear her out and they tell her, no, you're not a burden, we really do appreciate you. And it's just this really heartwarming and very serious scene, but they somehow found a way to add comedy to it, and it's just done really well. And I think it's probably one of my favorite scenes in the entire series. I'm not gonna lie, when I first heard about this show, I legitimately thought it was just going to be fantasy food wars. But as I continued to watch, I was pleasantly surprised of how well they used the food gimmick. It honestly doesn't take up too much of the episodes. The episodes can really be split into kind of two parts: the action and adventure, and then the food and downtime. And this is where a lot of like what I was talking about, where the characters kind of sit around the campfire, they kind of reflect on what they've been going through so far as they cook the monster of the episode, and it gives us something I think is very important in a fantasy adventure, and that's downtime. So many fantasy anime could benefit from just having the characters sit down for 2 seconds and reflect on what the journey has been so far, and so many of them just don't do that. It isn't simply just important to let us know what the characters are thinking, but it is the time to do exposition. This is the time for you to give us all the lore and what's going on in the world, and Dungeon Meshi really needs to do that because we never really leave the dungeon. So them sitting down around the campfire and talking about the world and painting this picture for us is really important, and allows us to start to ask questions, and maybe the next time that they sit down at the campfire, they'll answer the question. But they get so in depth with the world building that there's an actual food chain for the monsters. I have never thought about that before. I have never sat and thought about where a slime would sit on the food chain. Apparently pretty high according to Dungeon Meshi. These things are silent predators. They're sneaking up and suffocating people. That's insane. If you're like me and you have been avoiding this show because of the food gimmick, don't. It really does add to the show. It got to the point where I was even enjoying some of the stuff they were making. I was like, oh, ice cream made out of ghosts. That's actually really interesting. I wonder what that tastes like. Oh my god, am I becoming Leos? Am I gonna start wondering what every single monster that pops on screen tastes like? Yes, I did. I might have a problem now. Honestly though, my favorite part about the world building is just the races. Like normally a lot of times in fantasy anime we get demon people, beast people, elves, goblins, orcs, humans. You get the point. Yeah, we still have elves and dwarves and humans, but the humans are a little bit different. They're called tall men, their limbs are very long, and they're very tall people, and that kind of goes against the half-foots, which are kind of based on, you know, the halflings and hobbits and stuff like that from Lord of the Rings. And then we also have, you know, more unique stuff like ogres and kobolds. This is what kobolds look like, by the way, in Dungeon Meshi, which I found out the reason for this is because apparently kobolds aren't lizards in Japan. They are like furry little beast monsters, and I was like, huh, okay, I'm all for that, I guess. And we also have gnomes, and they do generally look very different than the half-foots. All the designs for the races look very unique and different compared to a lot of stuff that we usually see in fantasy anime. Overall, the creator of the series really tried to create their own world. They just looked at the blueprint of how to make a fantasy and then how to make a fantasy adventure and just followed it to the T. So yeah, it turns out the way to capture something most other fantasy anime can't is just to go back to the roots of fantasy storytelling and to have an imagination. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button and check these out. I will catch you guys in the next one. Bye bye.